They thought they were buying a gold mine. Wings, waitresses, and 400 packed locations. What could go wrong? In 2007, a private equity group poured $427 million into Hooters, expecting a comeback. Instead, they inherited a slow-motion collapse. But here's the twist. The food didn't fail. The fantasy did. What happens when the story your brand sells no longer fits the world it lives in? That's what we're unpacking today on Secrets Behind the Brand. Because this isn't just a failed investment. It's a masterclass in timing, culture, and how legacy can bury you. And it all started with one assumption that no one dared to question until it was too late. But before the collapse, there was the rise. And it all started with a fantasy that built an empire. For restaurants were a category, Hooters was the category. No one else had the nerve or the branding instincts to build a national chain around one provocative idea. Serve wings, sell beer, and make the waitresses the headline act. And somehow, it worked. In the late 80s and 90s, Hooters didn't just grow, it thrived. It wasn't competing with McDonald's or Chili's. It was selling something entirely different. A casual dining fantasy dressed up as sports bar Americana. By the early 2000s, Hooters had scaled into a full-blown cultural phenomenon. The orange shorts, the calendar girls, the wings that were, let's be honest, never really why people came. It was franchised aggressively, opened hundreds of locations, even launched its own airline, a literal flying bachelor party at 30,000 feet. And because no one else had pulled off the formula at scale, Hooters didn't need to evolve. The brand did the marketing. The nostalgia did the rest. Other chains tried to copy it. Tilted Kilt, Twin Peaks, but they were chasing a king. For nearly 20 years, Hooters was untouchable. It was a fantasy. It had the formula, and it had a customer base that saw it as harmless fun. But here's the trap of being first. You start believing you're the only one who can win. And when culture shifts, you don't pivot, you double down. In 2011, a group of investors had a pitch that sounded like easy money. Hooters was still profitable, still iconic, but it had gone stale. The menu felt dated. The brand felt like it hadn't changed since 1995. The uniforms? A cultural minefield. And in the world of private equity, that's catnip. So when Chanticleer Holdings, a small, publicly traded investment firm, got involved, they weren't just buying restaurants. They were buying a nostalgic brand with name recognition, loyal customers, and what they saw as global potential. Chanticleer had big dreams. They weren't some restaurant group with a proven track record. They were more like a financial experiment with a side hustle in chicken wings. Led by CEO Mike Pruitt, Chanticleer took a bold approach. Raised millions from retail investors, and used that cash to buy Hooters locations across the world. South Africa, Australia, Europe. They promised growth. They promised dividends. They promised that Hooters was a lifestyle brand with global legs. And at first, the stock price climbed. Investors were told they weren't just buying into a restaurant, they were buying into a revival, a comeback, a cultural asset that just needed the right polish. But behind the scenes, the numbers were shaky. The margins were thin, the culture was shifting fast. And while Chanticleer kept doubling down, the world outside Hooters was starting to look very different. What they didn't realize was that their biggest gamble wasn't financial, it was cultural. And that's where things started to unravel. Chanticleer's plan sounded like a no-brainer on paper. Buy Hooters locations worldwide, crank up expansion, and cash in on a proven brand. No need for flashy marketing. No risky reinvention. Just roll out the same formula that had worked for decades. But here's where it gets interesting. They doubled down on the exact things the market was moving away from. The skimpy uniform stayed. The same old menu stayed. The brand's reputation as a boys' club was ignored, not challenged. Instead of evolving, Chanticleer treated Hooters like a cash cow ripe for squeezing. They leased expensive properties, borrowed heavily, chased aggressive growth targets without fixing the core issues. No real investment went into rebranding or modernizing. No effort to shift public perception. And the result? Consumers began to see Hooters as outdated, tone-deaf, and out of touch with a culture demanding respect, inclusion, and progress. Meanwhile, competition wasn't waiting around. New casual dining brands offered better food, better vibes, and a brand story that felt fresh. But Chanticleer was trapped in their own hype. They bet $427 million on a brand frozen in time, believing nostalgia alone would drive growth. The market disagreed. Sales began to slip. Investor confidence faltered. The stock price tanked. What was supposed to be a winning formula turned into a perfect storm. Because in marketing, ignoring cultural shifts isn't just risky, it's fatal. Unlike the flashy failures you hear about, Hooters' downfall wasn't a sudden headline-grabbing disaster. It was a slow, quiet collapse, played out in empty booths, shrinking revenue, and franchisees losing faith. Chanticleer didn't crash and burn with a bang, they stumbled in silence. No big public relations fiasco, no viral backlash. Instead, they lost the subtle war for relevance. Locations started closing, some quietly, some with franchisees pulling the plug. The company tried to hide the pain behind rebranding efforts that felt half-hearted at best. Marketing budgets tightened, Investment and innovation? Minimal. They leaned on their legacy like a crutch, hoping nostalgia would keep the doors open. But here's the catch. The new generation of diners didn't want nostalgia. They wanted authenticity. They wanted brands that reflected shifting values about gender, respect, and inclusion. Hooters was stuck in the past, and the market moved on. Behind closed doors, Chanticleer's financials were bleeding. Debt piled up. Investors lost patience. The stock price, once a shining symbol of a revival, became a cautionary tale. By 2019, it was clear. The $427 million bet had gone sideways. The dream of global expansion and a Hooters renaissance? Dead on arrival. But the real story isn't just about failure.
It's about what happens when a brand refuses to change.
And what we can all learn when the cultural tide turns against you. Here's where it gets fascinating. People weren't just rejecting Hooters wings or its decor. They were rejecting what Hooters symbolized. For decades, Hooters sold more than food. It sold an experience wrapped in playful flirtation, escapism, and a little bit of rebellion. That worked when cultural norms were different. But culture isn't static. By the 2010s, the market was craving respect, inclusivity, and authenticity.
Suddenly, what once felt like harmless fun looked outdated or even offensive.
And here's the kicker. Consumers don't just buy products, they buy identity. They buy belonging. They buy stories that make them feel seen and valued. Hooters' brand story clashed with a new generation's values. No amount of nostalgia could paper over that. Meanwhile, competitors that tapped into evolving cultural narratives thrived. They offered a brand identity, rooted in community, empowerment, or simply better quality. Hooters became a mirror for something society was leaving behind. And as a brand, that's a death sentence. Because when your identity no longer aligns with your audiences, loyalty evaporates. Marketing psychology calls this brand dissonance, a gap between what the brand promises and what the customer feels. Hooters was stuck in a time warp, selling yesterday's identity to today's consumers, and the market moved on without them. Numbers don't lie. And in Hooters' case, they told a brutal story. By 2016, Chanticleer's financial reports revealed steep declines in revenue and profitability. Same-store sales were dropping year after year, signaling the core business was shrinking. Between 2014 and 2018, the number of Hooters locations in the US shrank by nearly 10%. The stock price? It fell from a peak near $10 per share to under $1 by 2019.
That's a 90% loss for investors.
Debt piled up to more than $200 million as Chanticleer borrowed heavily to fund expansion and keep operations afloat. In 2018, the company posted a $47 million net loss, a staggering figure for a brand once valued at over $400 million. Analysts pointed to a toxic mix, declining sales, cultural backlash, and mismanagement. Even franchisees who'd stuck with Hooters for decades started jumping ship or suing the parent company. Meanwhile, competitors like Wingstop and Buffalo Wild Wings grew aggressively, capturing market share with fresher branding and modern menus. Industry reports highlighted how Hooters' failure to innovate eroded customer loyalty and revenue. By 2019, Chanticleer sold off many Hooters locations to cover debts and focus on other ventures. The $427 million acquisition that once promised a renaissance turned into a financial disaster. It wasn't just a failed investment. It was a case study in how numbers reflect deeper strategic and cultural missteps. Because when the market stops believing in your brand, it shows in every quarterly report, every stock tick, every closed door. Success makes you a target. But failure? Failure turns the spotlight into a harsh interrogation. Behind the scenes, Chanticleer was locked in a brutal fight, not just with the market, but with itself. Franchisees grew restless, frustrated by declining profits and lack of support. Lawsuits piled up, accusing the company of failing to uphold franchise agreements and mismanaging operations. Internally, tension soared. Leadership clung to old ideas, while employees pushed for change. Culture clashes erupted as teams argued over how to save a brand stuck in limbo. Meanwhile, competitors smelled blood and doubled down. Copycat brands rushed to grab Hooters' fading customers with fresher concepts and bolder marketing. The media wasn't kind either. Stories of closures and lawsuits fueled a narrative of decline. Investors demanded answers and better results. But the more Chanticleer tried to fix things, the more it seemed they were patching cracks rather than rebuilding the foundation. In 2019, the company faced the painful reality they couldn't turn back the clock. The $427 million bet had turned into a costly lesson in hubris and inattention. Yet, even in defeat, the story is rich with insight, because it shows what happens when a brand refuses to evolve with its audience, and how the greatest marketing failure isn't losing customers, it's losing relevance. So what's the real takeaway here? This wasn't just a restaurant with bad timing, it was a brand built on a fantasy, and it never asked what would happen when the world stopped buying into it. Because Hooters didn't collapse overnight, it eroded quietly, piece by piece. And in that slow-motion collapse lies a masterclass, not just in marketing failure, but in brand survival. So what can we learn from it? First, legacy is a double-edged sword. The same nostalgia that made Hooters iconic also made it blind. When a brand leans too hard on its past, it stops earning its future. Second, cultural shifts aren't trends, They're turning points. What once felt like harmless fun can become a liability overnight. When society moves, your brand has to move with it, or risk becoming a relic. Third, people don't buy products, they buy stories. They buy identity, belonging, relevance. And when that story stops reflecting who they are, they walk away, no matter how many locations you have. Fourth, innovation isn't optional. Even giants fall when they stop evolving. If you don't reinvent the experience, someone else will, and they'll take your market share with them. Fifth, the real danger isn't outside, it's internal. The cracks at Hooters didn't start with sales. They started with leadership, denial, and a culture unwilling to adapt. A brand can survive bad press, but not bad decisions behind closed doors. And here's the final truth. Hooters didn't just lose customers, it lost relevance. And in today's market, relevance is everything. If you got value from this breakdown, hit that like button and subscribe to Secrets Behind the Brand. Let me know in the comments what brand, product, or strategy you want me to unpack next.
And until then, remember that
Great marketing doesn't just sell products, it sells perception.